When you step out into the garden in the morning, have you ever wondered why there are numerous holes in leaves that were perfectly beautiful just yesterday? Have you ever thought that if you just spray something one more time, everything will be fine? Have you ever felt that almost the exact same pest troubles return to almost the exact same spots every year? Have you ever tilted your head in confusion, wondering why the same thing happens again, even though you are supposed to be taking careful care of it? When tending a home vegetable garden, damage seems to arrive suddenly one day. Bite marks are found on tomato leaves that were healthy until yesterday. Some unpleasant change appears at the base of the gourd plants that had been growing smoothly. Such moments, while seemingly small, greatly shake your feelings. First you feel troubled, and then you think you must hurry and do something. Many people then look for a method that seems likely to work immediately. However, perhaps it is already a little too late at that point. What was lacking might not have been the amount of effort, but the time before the damage became visible. What is fascinating about Amish gardening lies precisely in that way of thinking. They do not view the garden as a battlefield against insects. They do not view it as a place to drive away every moving thing one after another. What is important to them is not eliminating everything, but maintaining the balance of the entire garden. If that balance is in order, even if pests are present, they are unlikely to multiply excessively. They tend to stay at a level that does not become a problem. In other words, what they aim for is not a completely sterile state, but a state that does not easily collapse. This way of thinking might sound like ancient wisdom. However, looking closely, it also overlaps with current concepts of sustainable gardening. Adding strong measures is not the only way to protect a garden. Noticing early, not repeating the same cycle of failure, devising ways to place and combine plantings, leaving an environment where helpful insects can work, intervening only when necessary. These ideas are very practical and reasonable. Rather than trying to excessively control the garden, it is about arranging the garden into a form where it can easily stabilize itself. What is important here is not to chase only the visible damage. There are holes in the leaves. The fruit is damaged. Of course, that is a problem. But what should truly be looked at is the flow of why it appeared there. Why does it happen in similar places every year? Why does it concentrate on specific vegetables? Why is it severe one year and not so much another year? The answers to those questions are hidden within the mechanism of the garden, not in a one-time treatment. The Amish people value that mechanism very much. They do not rush. First, they observe. They remember. They know how the seasons progress through their bodies. They remember what is likely to happen in which places. That is exactly why they can take action before the damage becomes severe. Rather than suppressing things with strong methods, they make it hard to collapse beforehand. That accumulation quietly makes the garden stronger. The 12 practices that will be introduced in this video from now on are not just a collection of minor tricks. Though each looks separate, they are actually within a single flow. Changing planting locations, placing compatible plants nearby, creating places where small allies can work, making morning patrols a habit, supporting with the gentlest possible methods only when necessary. As each of these overlaps, the garden gradually becomes a place that is hard for pests to take over. And perhaps the best part of this way of thinking is that you grow closer to your garden. If you only hurriedly deal with problems every time they occur, the garden will always be a source of anxiety. However, as you begin to set it in order, through daily observation and small contrivances, the garden becomes a place that teaches you. Where is it healthy today? Where is it straining a little? What should be changed to make next year easier? It will gradually begin to answer such questions for you. Therefore, the first thing to look at is not just on top of the leaves. It is inside the soil. What grew there last year? What was left behind? What survived the winter? If similar troubles return in similar ways, the reason might not be a coincidence. Starting from first realizing that the air of the garden begins to quietly change. Pests might not actually appear out of nowhere. Once you begin to think this way, How you view your garden gradually changes. You start looking not just at what is happening on the leaves, but at what occurred during the previous season. What did you plant? And where last year? What grew well in that spot? And what remains there as a memory within the soil? The wisdom of Amish gardening begins precisely by directing our attention to such invisible flows. Many people feel tempted to plant the same vegetables again in spots that yielded good results. If a certain spot produced an abundance of tomatoes last year, you naturally want to put tomatoes there again this year. If cucumbers thrived in a sunny corner, you want to plant cucumbers there again this year. That is a very natural inclination. We want to avoid failure and repeat the flow of success. However, that repetition can sometimes serve as welcome news for pests. Some pests overwinter in the soil and the remnants of old plants, or in the surrounding area across seasons. When spring arrives, and they awaken to find the exact same feast as last year, it may be unfortunate for us, but for the pests, it is an ideal beginning. This is where the concept of crop rotation becomes important. The Amish do not look at vegetables one by one, but group them by families with similar characteristics. Families like tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants. Families like squash cucumbers and melons. Families like cabbage, broccoli, and kale. And for each of these families, they shift the planting location slightly every year. Consequently, when the pests that were waiting in that spot since last year wake up in the spring, they find it difficult to locate their usual food nearby. That alone significantly alters the momentum of the pests. The beauty of crop rotation is that it is not flashy. It is not something that yields a dramatic change tomorrow, just because you did it today. However, as you accumulate 1 year, then 2 years, the very atmosphere of the garden changes. The troubles that seem to occur like clockwork every year gradually weaken. They don't grow as severe as before. The time spent scrambling to deal with them decreases. Such changes are quiet, but certain. The entire garden approaches a state that is less prone to collapse without requiring excessive force. Moreover, Amish wisdom does not end simply with swapping locations. Next, it progresses to the idea of which plants to place next to which other plants. These are what we call companion plants. However, the important thing here is not to think of them as magical combinations. It is not a matter of planting one thing and having everything solved. Rather, it is an approach to creating numerous small points of assistance throughout the garden. For instance, marigolds not only look bright and lend a gentle feel to the garden, but they are also expected to play a supplementary role around the roots and through their scent. Placing basil near tomatoes, placing dill near brassicas, adding chives beside leafy greens. While each of these combinations is subtle on its own together, they change the overall expression of the garden. What is even more fascinating is that these flowers and herbs do not just keep pests away, they also become places that invite allies. Small creatures like ladybugs, green lacewings, and parasitic wasps tend to gather around plants with small flowers. They work quietly. They are not the main actors of the garden, yet they play a vital role behind the scenes. Even if humans do not manage everything, other lives are operating within the garden. Once that state is established, even if pest problems do not disappear all at once, they become far less likely to cause a major collapse. Perhaps what many gardens lack is not stronger countermeasures, but richer layering. Adding flowers to a landscape where only a single type of vegetable is lined up, slightly altering the planting arrangements that had been in the same spots every year, placing helpful plants nearby. All of these are unassuming, but precisely because they are unassuming, they are easy to sustain, and because they are sustained, they become effective. As the foundation begins to settle in this way, the garden gradually calms down, and people too cease to be swayed by every single leaf, becoming able to calmly consider their next move. However, just because the foundation has been set in order does not mean you no longer need to do anything. The garden still requires daily eyes and hands. Next, we will look at just how big of a difference those small daily observations can make. As the garden's foundation gradually begins to settle, the way people move also changes. Instead of rushing out in a panic only when a problem arises, they begin to observe the garden at a much earlier stage. And that change is profoundly quiet. It does not mean that any special tools are added. However, the frequency of observation increases. The time spent standing still increases. The ability to notice small changes is nurtured. When observing Amish gardening, one clearly understands that this seemingly obvious habit actually creates a rather significant difference. Walking between the furrows while the morning air is still soft. Checking the undersides of leaves, confirming the condition of the stems. Searching for damage that was not there yesterday. Looking for clusters of eggs attached. Catching sight of leaf tips that look just a little less vigorous. All of these actions are unassuming. Yet when it comes to pest problems, the most unassuming things are sometimes the strongest. This is because finding a small anomaly early is far easier than dealing with the damage after it has grown large. If you notice the first few insects, the garden as a whole is still calm. If you notice the first row of eggs, there is still time. However, if left unobserved for just a few days, those small signs can spread all at once. This daily morning patrol holds a meaning beyond mere confirmation. It changes your feelings toward the garden. An unobserved garden becomes a place where anything could happen. But a garden observed every day gradually becomes a place you can read. Slugs tend to come here. I should pay special attention to the undersides of these leaves. The airflow in this area is slightly weak. You come to understand such things viscerally. In Amish households, children also naturally learn this way of looking. Finding insects is not an unpleasant chore, but becomes part of understanding the garden's changes. What matters is not to be afraid, but to notice. And once you notice, there is a very old and very certain method to employ. Hand-picking. To modern sensibilities, this might sound quite old-fashioned. However, on the scale of a home vegetable garden, it remains highly effective even today. If there is a large caterpillar on a tomato stem, remove it. If insects gather on potato leaves, take them off. If eggs are lined up on the underside of a squash leaf, scrape them off. And drop them into a container filled with soapy water. That is all. You are not spraying something over the entire garden. You are not sweeping up beneficial insects in the process. You are accurately handling only the problem areas. The precision of that selection is the greatest virtue of this method. If continued for just 10 minutes every morning, the extent of the damage will change significantly. Of course, hand-picking alone is not always enough. There are times when a little assistance is needed. What has been used since ancient times in such situations is a homemade spray using garlic and chili peppers. This aligns with Amish philosophy because it can be made from familiar ingredients, costs very little, and serves as a supplementary measure that does not rely too heavily on harsh substances. The strong scent of garlic and the irritation of chili peppers can make the garden feel like an inhospitable place for certain soft-bodied insects and leaf chewers. However, what is important here too is not to overstate its effects. This is not magic. It will not solve everything in a single application. Use it supplementarily while the damage is still light. Test it on a small area first. Avoid the hours of intense sunlight. Only through such measured use does this method work in a way that is gentle on the garden. Another known quiet helper is diatomaceous earth. It is a fine white powder that looks very mild. Yet when used in a dry state, it acts as a physical barrier against certain soft-bodied insects. What should be remembered here is that diatomaceous earth is only effective when dry. Its power diminishes after rain or on damp soil. Therefore, it is not simply a matter of scattering it and being done. It is crucial to carefully determine when and where to use it. Furthermore, because this powder is extremely fine, one should exercise caution when handling it. Choosing a natural method is not the same as taking safety lightly. Being gentle to the garden only holds meaning when it is sustained in a way that is also gentle to people. At this point, the garden gradually develops layers. There are contrivances to set the foundation daily, morning observations, the habit of hand-picking is needed, and gentle supplementary measures. Yet even so, young seedlings and particularly vulnerable vegetables sometimes require defense that goes one step further. What is useful, then, is not a forceful method of suppression, but a method that makes it difficult for them to approach in the first place. Next, we will look at how such defensive contrivances help the garden. As the foundation of the garden is set, and morning patrols become a habit, the approach to pest control shifts to something one step calmer. Instead of rushing to add something after damage has occurred, you begin to think about protecting things beforehand. What is useful here is not a method that seems overtly powerful. Rather, it is a contrivance that is very quiet and inconspicuous, yet certainly effective. Such methods create a flow where problems are less likely to begin without introducing unnecessary tension into the garden. One representative example of this is neem oil. When it comes to natural gardening, it is often spoken of as if it were a cure-all, but in reality, it is a tool better understood more moderately. It is convenient, but it is not magic. That level of distance is just right. Neem oil is most likely to be helpful while the damage is still small. It demonstrates its power more easily when used in the stage, before leaf-eating insects start to multiply, or while the entire garden is still calm. Conversely, if the situation has progressed considerably and you expect to solve everything at once, you might be disappointed. People who have accumulated experience like the Amish do not use such things in a rush. They choose the soft hours of the evening, not midday, when the leaves are hot. They handle it carefully around the time the light settles, and the surface of the leaves also becomes a little calmer. By doing so, they can provide the necessary help while making it harder to place an unnecessary burden on the plants. Apart from such liquid assistance, there is also a very straightforward method of protection. It is the method of placing a light cover over the furrow. It does not matter whether it is non-woven fabric, very light cloth, or fine mesh insect netting. The important thing is to establish protection early on during the period when the seedlings are young and tender. Create a gentle arch with thin stakes or flexible branches and drape it softly over the top. Just by doing that, light passes through air moves and water reaches them, yet many pests are unable to land on the leaves. The gratitude for this method is particularly well understood with vegetables like cabbage, broccoli, and kale. If eggs cannot be laid on the leaves, subsequent troubles are greatly reduced. There are situations where the same protective effect is easily felt with young plants of squash and cucumbers. The charm of this method lies in how very quiet it is. It is not defeating anything. It is simply like gently putting a door on plants in their vulnerable period, saying, "You cannot enter right now." Of course, this door must not remain closed forever. Once the flowers begin to bloom, insects that help with pollination will be needed. At that time, the cover is removed and the garden is opened up again. Such moderation is very important. It is clearly understood that harmonizing with nature does not mean leaving things wide open at all times, but protecting when necessary and welcoming when necessary. And there is another familiar and slightly surprising method. It is the beer trap for slugs. Anyone who has grown leafy vegetables might recognize the slime trails found in the morning or the way the edges of the leaves have been eaten, moving quietly during the night and leaving damage behind inconspicuously. Slugs are exactly that kind of opponent. Against such an opponent, the method of burying a shallow container in the soil and putting a small amount of beer inside has often been used in traditional gardens. If you feel using beer is a waste, a simple substitute using yeast and a little sweetness is also fine. Drawn by the scent of fermentation, slugs approach, fall inside, and find it difficult to get out. The mechanism is simple, yet in a home vegetable garden it can be surprisingly helpful. What makes this method interesting is that it does not rely on strong force. Knowing the opponent's movements, knowing the opponent's preferences, and simply placing a small trick there. Just by doing that, the night's damage can sometimes be alleviated. As you continue gardening, you notice that successful methods share a common trait. That is, it is not about taking a grand stance, but about observing closely. It is about knowing exactly what you are struggling with and taking action at the location and timing suited to that opponent. That accumulation gradually brings leeway to the garden. Reaching this point, multiple defenses are layered in the garden. There are contrivances in how things are grown daily, morning observations, gentle supplementary measures, as needed, physical covers, and small traps. However, there is still one more existence that, when added, brings this garden significantly to life. It is not a tool nor a bottle, but reliable companions that help the garden by actually walking around, eating, and moving. When numerous soft defenses are layered in the garden, it no longer looks like a place just for planting and harvesting vegetables. Within the soil, on top of the leaves, and between the furrows, small rolls breathe quietly, each supporting the balance of the garden, little by little. Within such a garden, there is a very rustic yet unforgettable sight. It is the sight of chickens walking slowly between the furrows, stopping moving again, and pecking at the ground with their beaks as they search for small insects. For many people, chickens might first come to mind as livestock that lay eggs. However, in places where the garden and daily life are deeply connected, it doesn't end there. While walking on their own feet, chickens find small creatures on the soil surface and near the leaves. They react swiftly to movements that human eyes might overlook. Watching them, it seems they are not merely walking through the garden, but performing their jobs within it. When led into a limited area during the hours when the morning air is still soft, or when the sunlight has settled down, somewhat chickens patrol between the furrows, picking up insects and small creatures. That sight clearly expresses what a reasonable way of helping looks like. It naturally conveys that protecting the garden does not always mean spraying something. Of course, what is important here too is moderation. Chickens are reliable, but they cannot be left free to roam anywhere at any time. Near seedlings that are still weak, they might trample and ruin them with their feet. If there are soft fruits, they might peck at them. There are also places where you don't want them scratching the soil. That is precisely why in a successful garden, chickens are not left completely loose. They become workers, welcomed at chosen times and places. Letting them in for only a short time, restricting them to areas that are somewhat established, not forcing them while observing the state of the garden. Only with such fine adjustments do chickens become allies of the garden. By eating insects, giving movement to the soil, and sometimes leaving behind fertilizer, they work as part of the garden's flow. Depending on the region, some people also fondly talk about guinea fowl. The sight of them moving briskly and becoming absorbed in searching for insects is very impressive. They are not necessarily suited for every garden, nor can everyone keep them. Still, this story remains in one's heart because it teaches us that the things that help the garden are not limited to tools and materials. Living creatures that walk, roam, pick, and work on their instincts can sometimes support the quiet equilibrium of the garden. Thinking so makes the garden look even more like a living place. While there are such active defenses, there are also somewhat quieter defenses. This involves planting strong scented plants near the edges of the garden or along fences. Plants with personalities in their very existence, like catnip and horseradish, change the quality of the air just by being there. The scent that softly rises when their leaves are touched makes the garden feel richer, and for some pests, that layering of scents might somewhat blur the comfortable signposts they follow. However, and this is a very important point, there is no need to speak of this as an all-powerful answer. This is because having strong scented plants does not mean all problems will disappear. Yet it is certain that adding these plants around the garden creates another soft layer in the space. Their value does not lie solely in the expectation of repelling pests. The addition of flowers and scents changes the expression of the entire garden. It becomes a garden you want to visit again and again. The places that catch your eye increase. The places your heart leans toward increase. As a result, such a garden is looked at often and tended to often. And the more a garden is looked at, the easier it is to notice small anomalies early on. Therefore, it seems that strong scented plants hold a splendid role not only in their direct effects, but also in the sense of closing the distance between the garden and people. As garden time flows, it naturally connects with kitchen time. After breakfast is finished, instead of throwing away the eggshells, immediately drying them, crushing them, and scattering them around lettuce and strawberries. Such a habit has continued in many households since olden times. This is because it has been thought that the sharpness of the crushed shells might make slugs and snails hesitate to move. Moreover, there is a somewhat pleasant cycle in the feeling of returning things from the kitchen to the garden. A lifestyle where used things return to the soil in a different form possesses a gentleness that produces no waste. However, this story fits better when told softly and honestly. Some people feel it works, while others don't notice much difference. Therefore, placing great expectations solely on crushed eggshells might be slightly off the mark. If slug damage continues on damp nights, combining it with more direct methods is more realistic. Even so, eggshells have a small meaning. They gradually return to the soil, and the remnants of the kitchen become part of the garden. That quiet cycle is by no means a bad thing. In other words, it is just right to view this contrivance not as a trump card, but as a small habit that gently connects daily life and the garden. The busily walking chickens, the fragrant plants along the fence, and the eggshells left over from the kitchen all teach us the same thing. The health of a garden is not born from a single strong method, but grows from numerous small contrivances working in their respective places. As the harvest progresses and the furrows gradually become quieter, that meaning begins to be felt even more deeply. The calmness of the next season is not determined solely by what is planted in the spring, because during the period when the garden is quieting down, the process of what to clear away, what to leave, and how to pass it on to the next has already begun. As the harvest basket fills and empties time and again, and the leaves and vines that spread so vigorously during the summer gradually lose their momentum, the air in the garden clearly changes. The light softens the areas of visible soil increase, and the wind too is somehow quiet. Standing amidst that quietness, you may sometimes feel as though the garden is taking a deep breath after running through a long season. However, what is truly important begins within that quietness. The calmness of the next season is not determined solely by the moment seeds are sown in the spring. Depending on what is cleared away, what is set in order, and what is not left behind, during the period when the garden heads into rest, the next flow has already begun to change its shape. The Amish place great importance on garden work as the harvest draws to a close. It is not merely tidying up to make things look clean. It is a crucial extra step to remove what has finished its role and create a state where signs of pests and diseases are unlikely to carry over to the next year. Completely weakened stems, withered leaves, dead vines, and remnants fallen on the ground if left alone. Such things might seem like they will simply return to the soil. However, eggs, larvae, and the sources of disease can sometimes lurk in their shadows. What was left behind with the intention of letting the garden rest can sometimes actually protect the seeds of trouble for the next season. That is exactly why cleaning up after the harvest has meaning. By taking out what is no longer needed, you slightly lighten the memories remaining within the garden. After a long season, everyone gets tired. That feeling is very natural. That is precisely why this work is better suited to proceeding quietly one step at a time, rather than bracing yourself aiming for perfection. Walking around and looking at one furrow at a time on a cool afternoon. Pulling up plants that have finished their roles, removing tangled vines, gathering fallen leaves, disposing of things with concerning diseases outside the garden. Just doing that changes the scenery significantly. Once the ground becomes visible, you come to clearly understand how that place has spent the past year. Where is it tired? Where does it still maintain its fullness? Where were the places where water tended to pool? Were there any spots where the wind had trouble passing through? It also becomes a time to confirm such things. The garden is always not just a place to grow vegetables, but a place that holds the records of the seasons. When you clean up as if reading those records, the way the next year looks will change. Once the things piled on top are removed, the meaning of tending to the soil surface comes into view next. What is important here is not forcefully turning it completely over, but slightly setting the surface in order, breaking down the places where pests had conveniently hidden themselves and making it easier for the cold air and winter changes to reach the upper layers. Just by doing that, the conditions of the garden become quite different. The winter cold itself can sometimes become an invisible help. There is a period when leaving things open holds more meaning than adding something. Thinking in this way, you realize that the garden heading from autumn to winter is not merely a place coming to an end, but a place being prepared for the next beginning. Within that flow, some people spread a thin layer of well-aged compost, or old compost, over the furrows. In Amish gardens too, such quiet care is not uncommon, not leaving the soil exposed, but letting it cross over the season while gently nourishing it. It is a very modest act, but when spring arrives, the difference emerges. The soil is a little softer. The smell is mild and it feels alive. The way it settles when seedlings are planted is different. Such changes, even if not flashy, are certain. When thinking about insect problems, nourishing the soil is not unrelated. If weak plants grow in weak soil, the leeway of the entire garden wears thin. Conversely, if the soil is settled, the plants will also grow effortlessly, and the garden becomes less prone to collapse. Looking back like this, it is clearly understood that none of the contrivances so far were separate minor tricks. Crop rotation gradually shifts the memory of the soil and severs the flow of pests. Companion plants create a supplementary layer in the garden. Small flowers become a habitat for beneficial insects. Morning patrols become the power to find anomalies while they are still small. Hand-picking, using soft materials, sometimes welcoming living helpers, and adding fragrant plants, they all point in the same direction. It is not about suppressing the garden all at once, but gradually putting it in order and guiding it to a state that is hard to collapse. Some are firmly supported by research, and some have been passed down through long experience. However, if each is used in the right place, they grant the garden a reasonable strength. The charm of this method also lies in the fact that you do not need to seek perfection. There will be holes in the leaves. There are years when things do not go as planned. If there is too much rain or the heat lingers, any garden will be affected. Even so, people become able to face it more calmly than before, able to notice early, able to change the way of planting, able to add just the necessary amount of support when needed. And you can learn that you do not have to suppress everything by yourself. That feeling not only protects the garden, but also softens the feelings of the person in the garden. What remains at the end is a very quiet understanding. A healthy garden is not a garden without a single insect. It is a garden where the soil breathes, insects visit the flowers, birds occasionally come, and people can step into it with peace of mind. It is a state where life does not lean too far to one side, but is maintained while each has its own place. When the soft light falls on the furrows after the harvest is finished, and the wind begins to turn slightly cold, that becomes clearly understood. Garden work does not end simply with planting, growing, and harvesting. Clearing away, waiting, and passing things on to the next, they are all included within it. Sending the seasons off carefully, while accumulating small contrivances. To that accumulation, the garden will surely respond with something. And that response is quieter, gentler, yet longer lasting than you might think. Lasting.